Brother. Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you. I remember the first time I was here, you blew me away with your worship at chapel. I get the honor to speak at chapels all over North America, and I have often commented on the quality of your music here. No surprise to you, but it blew me away. And then, so I came in today thinking, okay, well, I know that there's going to be good quality. And then they doubled down on it by writing their own music. So okay, whatever. So that was a wonderful time of worship. So I do study. What I study for the last. It's been about 18 years I've been doing this work, but I've been studying the experiences of Christians, primarily Christians, who experience same-sex sexuality, and they're trying to make sense of their sexuality in light of their faith. They're trying to make sense of their faith in light of their sexuality. So I really study the intersection between those two areas of a person's life and what that's like for them in a changing culture in which there's more available to people, more pathways, more ways to kind of figure this out than ever before. So it's been interesting to have the honor really to listen to people. In fact, I think the first study we published like this about students at Christian colleges, we called it Listening to Sexual Minorities at Christian College Campuses. And I'm just using sexual minorities there as a shorthand. In psychology, that's what you call someone who experiences same-sex sexuality despite behavior, despite identity labels. We just refer to them that way. So I'm not using it as a civil rights argument. I'm just using it as an argument, as a way that we talk about it in my field. Anyway, let me tell you ask you to do a little thought exercise. I want you to think a little bit about when you first gave your life to Christ, the first time you became a Christian. For me, I was in high school and I was on a youth retreat, and I think we had a guest speaker for our youth group. It was at the Ocean, maybe Ocean City, Maryland, I think it was. And the guest speaker was a Baptist minister who just put the fear of hell into all of us. And so I just hey, sign me up. At the end of the week, you're tired, you haven't eaten, you haven't slept. I was sign me up for whatever, at this point, which I'm not recommending this as a model, but and it's for me, it's stuck. My youth pastor discipled me over the next couple of years. But anyway, I want you to think about the time when you first gave your life to Christ. And imagine that you now are a new Christian and you've been asked to lead a Bible study of other new Christians. Can you imagine how challenging that would be? How do you guide other people when you just gave your life to Christ? I would have been in no position to do that. I was needed to be discipled for the next couple of years before I would have much fruit in my life to be able to share with other people. But anyway, so in this group, you have two people who are gay and Christian, and they're asking you, what does this mean for me? And you barely just gave your life to Christ, and you're wondering, that's a really good question. What does that mean for you? Because I'm not even sure what this means for me. Now, I'm giving you this as a hypothetical for you, hypothetical for me, but this really happened to a young pair of Christians. They were a married couple, and one was a professor at Lynchburg College, which is near me, but then was on sabbatical at Oxford. And his wife gave her life to Christ. They fell in with a group of Christians at Oxford. She gave her life to Christ, and he would give his life to Christ shortly after that. And they were asked by the students, would you, lead a Bible study for us as new Christians? And so they, what do you do? So they said, oh, sure, we'll do that, but we don't really know what we're doing. And two of the group members were gay, and we're asking them about what a life in Christ meant for them. Now, they did what most people do today, is they wrote to a Christian leader about this, and they said, what advice would you give us? What would you tell us about how to do this? Now, How many of you read C.S. Lewis or read anything by C.S. Lewis? You like C.S. Lewis? Yeah, he's sort of the patron saint of evangelicalism. So this is what happened. I'm telling the story here of Sheldon Van Auken and his wife, Jean. They called her Davy, so Sheldon and Davy. And so this is late 1930s, early 1940s. He was on sabbatical at Oxford, and Jean knew C.S. Lewis. And so when this happened, they wrote to Lewis. Can you imagine? This was, I don't know if you can imagine this, but it was before email and before all of that. So they actually wrote him. I know it looks funny, but they wrote him and sent him a letter. And he wrote back. It's the only time that we have documented where C.S. Lewis wrote about the topic. And so he's trying to be helpful. And let me just share a little bit about what he said. The first thing he says is, this is only an interim report. This is what you say to someone when you say, I need a little more time to think about this, but I'm trying to give you an answer to help you, but I got to tell you, I'm going to start here, but I need some time to think about this. And to our knowledge, he never wrote about it again, but he said, this is an interim report. And he said, look, first, just to map out the boundaries within which all discussion must go on. So he's trying to create a framework. Let me give you the parameters. Let me give you the boundaries. Let me map this out for you. He says, let me start there. And then he says, look, I take it for certain that physical satisfaction of this desire would be sin. He says, and he's keeping here with how Christians have understood the place of same-sex behavior, both historically and even today globally. There is a great deal of consensus in this area, although I know there's debate in the church in the West, but a great deal of global consensus for Christians and certainly historical consensus. So Lewis reflects that, and he says, look, I take it for certain that acting on this would be sin, but that leaves the person no worse off than anyone who is, for whatever reason, prevented from marrying. And then he goes on to say, our speculations on the cause are not what matters, and we must be content with ignorance. And then he brings up an interesting passage. He says the disciples were not told why in terms of the efficient cause or the direct cause, why the man was born blind in John 9, only the final cause, that the works of God should be made manifest in him. That is, it suggests that in homosexuality, as in any other tribulation, those works can be manifest. That is, that every disability conceals a vocation, if only we can find it. Now, I'm going to come back to those two words, especially because disability probably sounds a little odd to our ears today, and the issue of vocation. But I want to mention just the first part that really struck me, because Lewis goes past the two most frequently asked questions I get as a director of this institute, studying the experiences of Christians navigating their sexuality. And those two most frequently asked questions are, what causes it, and can it change? Those are by far the two most frequently asked questions. And they figured prominently in the cultural wars about sexuality in our culture. Because since the early 1990s, there's been a theory about causation that's been advanced through dozens and dozens of studies suggesting that nature would be the cause rather than nurture. And many conservatives in our country have responded to that by saying it can't be nature, it has to be. And then they either say willful disobedience or they'll say something like something from nurture. And there's a couple of theories there that conservatives really like. But anyway, it struck me that Lewis just passes right by the causation argument and the change argument. He doesn't even go there. He says we're going to have to be content with ignorance. But this is the 1940s. I mean, surely we're not going to be content with ignorance today. It's 2016. Well, I wish I could tell you better. But we actually don't really know. Even my own field, the American Psychological Association, their statement on this is we really don't know what causes sexual orientation. The conclusion tends to be it's probably contributions from both nature and nurture. So I think setting it up in the culture war language that it's nature versus nurture is probably not helpful. We know people will vote differently if they believe one or the other, so there's reason to make the argument one way or the other. But I'm going to ask Christians in an educational institution to rise above the cultural war about sexuality and try to discern what we know and what we don't know in this area as humble stewards of the best of science in this area. And I think the best of science would say it's not a question of nature versus nurture. It's not one or the other. It's probably more of a both and. So, and I don't even think there's one pathway. It's like if you wanted to get from Chattanooga to the West Coast, there's multiple ways for you to get to the West Coast from here. And it's a principle we call equifinality. There's multiple pathways to the same endpoint. Multiple ways for you to get from Cleveland to the West Coast. Now, there's also multiple ways to be at the West Coast. You could be in Oregon, you could be in Northern California, you could be in Southern California. And so, in a sense, there's not just multiple ways to get there that we don't fully understand, but there's multiple ways to be there. There's differences among men who experience same-sex attraction than among women, and there's differences among women and among men. So I actually think it's more accurate to say there's multiple homosexualities. There's a great deal of diversity within the community, multiple ways to get there. In the Christian community, the two most frequently, probably the two favorite arguments for causation would be faulty parent-child relationships or something like childhood sexual abuse. And I got to be honest with you, if I'm tough on the studies on nature, I've got to be equally tough on the studies on nurture. And I just don't think there's a great deal of support empirically right now for either of those theories. They're interesting, and I'm open to research being done in that area, but I think to say that parents are causing it is a mistake. I think that leaves parents feeling a great deal of guilt, which they should not feel, because I don't think they're doing something that causes it. And I also don't think it's because of abuse. I think abuse does complicate sexuality for people who are survivors of sexual abuse. But I don't think it directly causes people to experience homosexuality. I think it just complicates this area of their life for anybody that way. But most people who experience sexual abuse go on to develop a heterosexual orientation. So to think of it as the direct cause, I think, would be a mistake. So I'm kind of with Lewis on, I think we have to be content with ignorance even today. So I would hold theories about causation sort of loosely with humility, that there's a lot there we really don't understand. For what it's worth, we also don't understand how heterosexuals develop an orientation towards the opposite sex, so we're sort of equal opportunity agnostic about that. So the other thing that struck me about Lewis is he doesn't really go at change at all. And that's been such an important part of evangelicalism over the last 30 years, was to argue that you can make gay people straight. And Lewis doesn't even go there. He doesn't suggest ministry. He doesn't suggest counseling. He suggests the issue of vocation, which I'll come back to in a minute. Now, a few years ago, we published a study that we had tried to study whether people could change their orientation through involvement in Christian ministries. And we studied people for 3 years. That was published in a book form. If you're looking for great reading, maybe for the summer, it's just 400 pages of research on people trying to change. Let me commend that to you. Or maybe you'd like to read something else. But then we published it in a peer-reviewed journal article. And I read recently that an average of 3 people read a peer-reviewed journal article. So that was a little, I gotta tell you, that was a little sobering for me. So I count my mom as one, and then there's probably 2 other people. So it's tough being an academic. So anyway, we were tracking people over 6 years trying to change their orientation through involvement in faith-based ministries. And I got to tell you, nobody liked our study. In the culture wars, you either believe that this is an immutable characteristic or it's something that you can easily change through prayer and counseling. And we found that the truth was somewhere in between. We did show that some people did experience meaningful shifts along a continuum that pushed back against the idea that it's an immutable, unchanging characteristic. But most people didn't experience as much change as they had hoped for. And so that pushes back against the claim that anybody who tries hard enough or has enough faith can expect dramatic change. Now, if you know somebody whose testimony is dramatic change, I'm not taking away from that testimony. What I'm trying to bring into this is a little bit of humility that testimony is not the most likely outcome. The most likely outcome is that most people experience less of a change than they had hoped for. And then you're talking about living with more of an enduring condition, and how do you submit that to God? And what does it look like to be a faithful follower of Christ with a more of an enduring experience? So anyway, I'm going to come back to these two words I said I would talk with you a little bit more about. So Lewis says that every disability conceals a vocation if only you can find it. Now that language, disability, probably doesn't sit well with most people navigating this terrain. But I did talk with somebody. This is a friend of mine who is gay and is a Christian, and she is celibate. Her name's Karen, and I was interviewing her when I was working on a book for youth pastors on this topic. And she took me out of the gay debate into the deaf debate to teach me something, which was helpful because I didn't know there was a deaf debate. So this was really good for me to kind of catch up with where we were going here. And she herself is deaf, and she just shares this with me. Let me read it to you. She says, in the world of hearing loss, you have those who are deaf with a capital D and those who are deaf with a lowercase d. And these two groups are well distinguished and identified. Anyone who uses capital D deaf knows that she is referring to something more than small d deaf. People who are deaf with a capital D comprise a culture. They do not see themselves as having a disability. They see themselves as a people group with their own language, their own culture. On the other hand, those who are deaf with a lowercase d do not see their hearing loss as an identity. Instead, they see it as a disability or a medical condition. This group is more likely to be oral. That is, they often undergo intensive training to lip read. They use their voice to communicate instead of using sign language, and some might also seek a cochlear implant. When they say, I am deaf, they are not saying, I am deaf with a capital D. And at times there's contention between the two groups because of a way of understanding their experience of hearing loss. For example, those who are deaf with a capital D see cochlear implants as threatening and an extreme offense. They don't believe anything needs to be fixed. You see, they celebrate their identity as deaf. And so what Karen was saying is, if you step out of the gay debate into the deaf debate, those lines are more clear. But it's true within the LGBT community that not everybody who experiences themselves as gay would think of themselves as gay in the same way the broader culture does. Not every Christian sees it as signaling a person or a culture to be celebrated. That there are those of us, Karen would say, who see it more like a disability, and maybe that language doesn't resonate for students today who are navigating this terrain, but it really goes to what Wesley Hill, who wrote a book called Washed and Waiting about his own experiences as a gay Christian. He describes himself as living with a kind of thorn in the flesh, kind of the way Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 12, that there are some things that you experience and maybe you pray, God, would you take this away? And God says, my grace is sufficient for you. I'll be present in this with you rather than remove it. And I think that's the way someone like Wesley Hill, as a celibate gay Christian, has kind of oriented his mind around this, similarly to how Karen has. Now, Lewis would go on then to mention vocation. You know that Luther expanded our understanding of vocation, that it wasn't just for the priesthood. Vocation was for every Christian in areas of our lives like our families, the marketplace, education, the church, that we all have things that we're called to do, that we have vocations in the areas that we honor God with your education, with the work you'll be called to do, and your music, and so on and so forth. And so Lewis would write that, look, there's a vocation here for people navigating these concerns. He actually spoke of an older gay man who had written to him previously. He had destroyed that letter, as we all do when we get these letters from people that are quite, vulnerable, and we get these letters from Christians figuring these things out. So he couldn't quite remember all the details, but this was a devout Christian who had written to him, who had said to him, I think there is something, as a gay man, something different about me. He talked about, could this be turned to spiritual gain? There were certain kinds of sympathies and understanding, a certain role socially that I can have as a gay man that others could not have or give. And perhaps a gay person who humbly accepts their cross and puts themselves under divine guidance will be shown the way. And then Lewis says, I wish I could be more definite. All I've really said is, like all other tribulations, it must be offered to God, and God's guidance for how to use it must be sought. And this would be characterized by humility and divine guidance. How do you use something that is more of an enduring condition? How do you offer it to God? There's no one answer, but let me offer a few thoughts. First is this idea of doing it with humility. This is going to be increasingly difficult because the broader culture has adopted what I sometimes refer to as a gay script. And it's a way of understanding your sexuality that you're not going to Google it and find this, but it's the idea that these attractions are central to your sense of personhood. They distinguish types of people. There are gay, straight, and bisexual types of people. And by virtue of your same-sex sexuality, you can denote a people group, an emerging culture to be celebrated. And so the humility here would be to see this differently, would be to recognize how compelling that script would be, but to say, you know what, while the broader culture may move in that direction, at the end of the day, I have to think about how, as a Christian, I ought to orient myself towards the person and work of Christ. With humility, I'll approach this area of my life. It's harder today than when Lewis wrote this to Sheldon and Davy Van Auken, because there's a greater cultural celebration that you'd be sort of swimming against the stream. And I recognize that. That would be a difficult place to be. The second, in addition to humility, would be divine guidance. The idea of being a good steward of my sexuality, seeking God's guidance in this part of my life. And this is the idea that you would dare to hope that there's a good and loving Father whose plan for your sexuality is better than the culture's plan for your sexuality. And this is really true for all of us. At some point, after you gave your life to Christ, through the work of the Holy Spirit, you began to trust that there really is a good and loving Father whose plan for your sexuality would be better than your own. And this is true if you're single, if you're married, if you're gay, if you're straight. At some point, you decide, is God's plan better than my own plan? Is God's plan better than the broader cultural plan? What would it look like to submit this part of my life to a kind of costly obedience to the will of the Father? And it only really happens if you believe that the Father in heavens is a good Father whose plan would be better than your own. And that is a risk. That is a hard thing to do. And the last thing I would say for the person navigating this terrain is that these are not people to just reach down to for the rest of us, to pity and look down upon, to pull up. These are people to reach across to. These are gifted, talented Christians navigating a very difficult area of their life in a broader culture that's at war about the very thing that they are figuring out. So you don't reach down to them, you reach across to them as talented, gifted people. I remember a pastor sharing a story with me, and I'll just share it with you. It's a story about a nobleman in the 1800s who wondered what his legacy would be. He wanted to leave something behind that would speak to what was most important. So after giving it quite a bit of thought, he decided he would actually build a church for the townspeople. That would be his legacy. So of course this took quite a bit of time. This is the 1800s. And when it was done, he felt that he had something that would be a fitting legacy for the people of the community. And so when the church was completed, the townspeople all came around to look at it with him, and they were enjoying what was the gift to them. But in time, one of the onlookers noted what looked like kind of a fatal flaw. There were no lamps. You see, there were lamp stands, there were areas, holders for lamps, but no lamps. And the nobleman brought everyone in the town together and gave everybody a lamp. And he said to them, "When you are here, it will be lighter. I want you to bring your lamp every time you come to worship, because when you're here, it will be lighter. And when you're not here, it will be darker. Realize that when you're not here, some part of God's house will be darkened." And I think that's what you want to say to fellow brothers and sisters in Christ navigating these issues in their life in faith, is bring your gifts, bring your light. You're part of the body. We recognize that you're navigating very difficult terrain, but we want you here. You're in the right place. Now, I guess to fellow Christians, for most people, this is not your story. This is not an area that you deal with in your life. And I guess I'm asking you, do you want to walk with those brothers and sisters who are navigating this terrain? Do you want to do that? Sheldon and Davy did. So they wrote this letter to C.S. Lewis and they asked for help. So I'm asking you, would you be willing to walk alongside people navigating this terrain? I think the most frequently asked question for students at Christian colleges who are navigating these issues is, do you want me here? And as a person in a residence hall, in a sports team, friends of mine having coffee, I'd want to tell them, I want you here. Of course, you're in the right place. Now, sometimes we do things that make it difficult for them to be here. We crack jokes, we talk about the gay community in very derogatory ways. We sort of contribute to the culture wars in the ways that we talk about things, and it creates a kind of atmosphere that might make it difficult for someone on my floor to sort of come forward and say, this is part of my life. So I think we can do better there. And I'll be talking later today in a talk about how you and I set the climate for a campus in this area. It's not about being pro-gay or anti-gay. It's about being pro the image of God in all people. I was also struck that Lewis took a devout Christian who wrote to him, a pious Christian who wrote to him as gay, to be a fellow Christian. He said to him, I have more in common with you by virtue of our shared faith than there are differences by virtue of our sexuality. And he treated him as such. This was a pious, devout, gay person who had written to him. Indeed, we share a longing for completion. It's different, and there are increasingly difficult cultural challenges for the person navigating those issues. But I think to recognize the person who says, I'm a follower of Christ as a follower of Christ, and being able to walk with them and encourage them in that, in Christian discipleship, would be a great help to them. And the last suggestion I have for fellow Christians for whom this is not your story, fellow Christians, is this: to live out vocation in your own life. To be an example of what you're asking someone else to live into. That, in other words, we ought to all be living a kind of costly obedience as Christians. If you then turn to a brother and sister in Christ who's navigating this area, it doesn't have the same integrity to do it if it's not vocation for you in your own life. Can I be a good steward of my sexual impulses? Single or married, gay or straight, what will it look like to make my impulses subject to God's authority, to trust God as a good father whose plan for my sexuality is better than my own? Look, friends, as the band sang in the opening, we are all going through a wilderness of some kind. And God, you were with me all the time. Amen.